very great honour and pleasure for me to be able to be here, and it's wonderful to be able to come to such a big audience and to speak about something as important as this. When Bob Carr was told he was going to be Foreign Minister by the Prime Minister not so long ago, the first microphone that was brought to him said, "What are your priorities?" The very first microphone. So before he even had time to speak to anybody, before the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade even knew that he'd been appointed, "What are your priorities?" And he said, "Australia's seat in the Security Council, AusAid and Burma." So the only country he named was that one. He didn't even name his favourite country, the United States. Quite interesting that should be. And I know Bob Carr quite well for all kinds of historical reasons, and I said to him later in correspondence that it's interesting that you named Burma. And he said, "Because I believe it. It's a very important country for us to sort out, for us to understand, and for we Australians to work with constructively." And so this evening tonight is an opportunity to talk about how things can be done constructively, and that constructive attitude or approach will have to depend on how we assess what the reform programs are and what that all means. And then I would ask myself, why should I be speaking here? I was ambassador there until the end of 1989, and that's a little bit further ago than yesterday for a lot of people. Some people here were around at that time, watching things very closely, and some were also there while I was there, and I'm very happy to see faces from the times gone by. Hairstyles have changed a bit. The rest of it's just like since '89, when I was there, I went through a succession of other postings with Foreign Affairs, and I ended up as ambassador to Yugoslavia in 1997 to 2000. And so my experiences included being in Burma at the time of the collapse of the socialist regime, the processes that followed that, and then the arrival of the military in power in September 1988. In Yugoslavia, I was present for the time of what was known to NATO and the United States as humanitarian bombing, exercise designed to induce Mr. Milosevic to realize that the error of his ways, or if that wouldn't happen, to get the people to disavow him. Humanitarian bombing and things like it have never achieved that sort of objective and didn't achieve it then. But what happened in Burma left a very deep feeling in the hearts of everybody who was there. And for me, it was kind of special. I'd been there first as a 19-year-old tourist in 1965 on what was then allowed as a 24-hour visa, so I saw everything in 24 hours, 23 or 20, minus the time at airports. I went again in 1972 for Foreign Affairs when I was the Deputy Head of Mission in our embassy. And in the period between 1972 and 1974 when I was there, the processes that led to the ending of the military government that seized power in 1962 and its replacement by what they called the Socialist Republic of the Union of Burma were taken. So I was there at the Chakkasan racecourse, which was stopped being a racing environment in 1964, but it was still called the racecourse, and I was there when they raised the flag of the Socialist Republic of the Union of Burma, as the country was called. In 1988, when the military took power in September, the Socialist Republic was no more, and the country's name was changed. And one of the wonderful old people, and if you go and see the film The Lady, you'll see him driving a car with Aung San Suu Kyi in it when she arrives in the country. His name was Leo Nichols. Leo, who is a Burmese, despite the name that you hear, said, "Chris, you are the only foreigner who was present for the birth and death of the Socialist Republic." So I used this as part of my cachet. Then, after my time in Yugoslavia, I retired from Foreign Affairs and went to work for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in Geneva, and was there for 10 years. In that time, I carried in my blood vessels Burma and everything that it meant. It's a country that infects you. And if you decide that, having visited China and Cambodia and other places, that you'd like to visit Myanmar in a year ahead, beware that you will get that disease. It's absolutely infectious. You cannot go to that country without being taken by it, body and soul, and trying to work as best as you can to see how the country is going to evolve. So after we left, and my wife Gay is here, she's over there next to the camera, on the wrong side of the camera tonight. We were there at a time of this critical importance for the country that we've been back since many times. The last time I was there was in October last year, and I have kept up with all the people that I met over the years, starting in, not 65, I can't promise that, but from 72 onwards, kept up with the people there and understood what they thought about what was happening to their country. And there's a little story I should just tell before going into other detail about where we go with reform. I was there, as I said, from 72 to 74, at the time when they introduced the Socialist Republic of the Union of Burma. And they had a constitution, a one-party state. The constitution, as it happens, and I can explain more about this later if you like, was modelled on the East German constitution, so it wasn't really a good model for long-lasting success. And it was very difficult to operate, extremely bureaucratic and cumbersome. When I came to present my credentials as ambassador in '86, I went to the president, who by that time was U San Yu, and I'd sent a message to them, to the foreign ministry people, saying that I knew San Yu because I'd met him in 1973 when they were drafting the new socialist constitution, and I'm looking forward to talking about that with him. And they said, "That's impossible, he doesn't speak English." Right. I knew that he spoke English. So, but I said, give him the message that I'd like to speak to him. They said, no, it's a formal ceremony. You go there, you make a speech, you hand over the letter of your credentials as ambassador, and you leave. So I said, all right. So I went there. He had received the message, and he said to me in English, in front of these people, "Mr. Lam, it's very nice to see you again. I don't remember you personally, but I do appreciate what you've said. Let us go and have a cup of tea together." And then he said to the foreign ministry people and the others, "Go away, we will talk alone." And so he said, "What do you think of our constitution and the way it's worked in all that time?" And I said, "Frankly, Mr. President, I didn't think it was much of a constitution then, and I think it's too heavy for the country. The layers of government that it places on people from the national level down through states, townships, villages and urban wards, you have 4 levels of government, and I don't think it's sustainable." And he said, "I think you're right, and we're going to have to change it one day, but for the time being I can say to you that as long as the people can eat, the government has no problem." So I reported that to Canberra, this vital piece of information, which they filed, I guess, as people would. In 1987, the government, and they were in control of the government, is still the head of the Burma Socialist Program Party, and not in government himself, but in control of all the events. Because of astrological prophecies and some other things that had happened in the country, they declared all currency to be without value, and people had to bring in their demonetized notes and replace them with new ones. They did that, but a lot of people had stashed their money in the mattress or hidden it somewhere, didn't want to come along with money, which people might then ask, where did you get all that money? So a lot of people found themselves broke or unable to sustain themselves, and by March the following year, March 1988, problems had begun to surface over the cost of food. And there was an incident called the tea shop incident in northern Rangoon, not that far from the airport, not in the Rangoon University, but in a technical university area, because of the price of food and its quality in a tea shop. The tea shop incident ignited the struggles that began in 1988. It wasn't caused, despite what you might hear from elsewhere, by a demand for democracy. It was caused by the price of food. And then it ignited and went further, and students became involved, and many other things happened. In April 1988, Aung San Suu Kyi, who is there, came back to visit her dying mother in the hospital. Gay and I knew the family and knew her mother well, and we often went to the hospital and we saw the mother frequently during her hospitalization up until the time that she died. And it was there at the bedside in the Japanese hospital, not the Rangoon General that you will see in the film, but the Japanese hospital, in her private room, not in the public ward that has been put into the film being The Lady. It was there that I first met Aung San Suu Kyi, at her mother's bedside. It was very moving, and we knew each other quite well through that period, from 88 through 89. And then, of course, events moved along, and I don't have to go into it for you because I'm sure that a lot of you would know that, but feel free to ask questions. She ended up in house arrest in July 1989. The main reason being that on the 19th of July, which is the anniversary of the death of her father. Now I have to operate this thing. What you will see here is, if you want it, is all the people who led the country from its independence and just before. Aung San, her father, was the man who would have been Prime Minister of the country but for the fact of his assassination. He was assassinated on that day, the 19th of July 1947. He was aged 32. And it's important to keep these things in mind. That's why he had such a young family. Aung San Suu Kyi herself was a little girl at the time that these things happened. The last British governor, Sir Hubert Rance, left on Independence Day, the 4th of January 1948. Aung San was dead and government was handed to U Nu. U Nu was the leader of a political party called the Anti-Fascist People's Freedom League, the AFPFL. This was a political party imbued with the idea of socialism. Socialism was very popular around the world in the 1940s. You might remember, those of you old enough, Ben Chifley and the Bank Nationalisation Act, and the things that were happening all around the world. The AFPFL in Burma was part of the constellation of politics at that time, but there were many people who believed deeply that socialism was the answer for the country. But the other thing that had happened was that Aung San, in his dealings with Sir Hubert Rance and the British, had come to an accommodation about how to handle the issue, problem, question, challenge of the ethnic states surrounding the colonised area, the colony of Burma. The country colonised by the British was the part of Burma, generally, largely speaking, and there's a challenge in what I'm saying, but largely it was the area occupied by the Burma people, the Burman people. The other parts of what is now the country were occupied by people who were Shan, Kachin, Karen, Chin, Kayar, various different ethnic groups. They were agglomerated into the country that was given independence on the 4th of January 1948, and the British named it Burma. There were people then who found this a difficult thing to stomach because Burma was more than the British colony. Anyway, they became independent. U Nu found himself saddled with this result and welcomed it. But the agreement that brought that into place was called the Panglong Agreement, done in the town of Panglong, and it's what associated all these groups together with the Burmans to create the new country. They never settled. Civil war broke out very quickly. People divided in all sorts of factions and ideas. They didn't necessarily challenge the concept of socialism, as it was understood, but they challenged the nature of the country. And so in 1958, with the country on the verge of breakdown, U Nu invited General Ne Win, the commander of the armed forces, to take provisional charge of the country, restore order, and then hold elections again. If you read about this in Wikipedia or other parts of the web, you will hear, or you will read, that Ne Win mounted a bloodless coup. He didn't. He was actually asked by U Nu to look after the country and have elections again, which happened in 1960. U Nu won the elections in 1960. In late 1961, U Nu said that he was going to have to do something about the states and the Panglong Agreement. Ne Win said, no, you're not going to do that, and there was the coup on the 2nd of March 1962 that saw U Nu imprisoned, the government locked up, a lot of wonderful people lost their freedom, and the country went into the downward slide from which we're now discussing today, the prospect of emergence. Can we have confidence in that? Ne Win, there he is, Army General, set up the Burma Socialist Program Party. They invoked the Burmese way to socialism in 1964. In 1972, with preparation going ahead for the proclamation of the Socialist Republic, which was going to continue the socialist policies of the AFPFL, Ne Win retired from the army and became U Ne Win, and that's a picture of him in his post-army time. No one believed that he was out of the army. He remained the man in charge and he kept control of the party. He went on as head of the party, but without the title of state president, after he handed over the state presidency in 1981 to his loyal Deputy General San Yu, the man to whom I presented my credentials and who had retired from the army himself before. They were very strict about their obedience to the law. If the law said army people can't be in politics, they had to retire, and Ne Win was insistent about that. And it's one of the things that's relevant to considering the state of the country now. They may have bad law, but they will obey it. It's a curious thing, and there are a lot of other countries where they don't care about the law, but in that country they will obey the law, but they will write bad law, generally speaking. The law, on the other hand, that was used to intern Aung San Suu Kyi in house arrest is, as in many countries in the world, a holdover from the colonial days. They used British law to intern Aung San Suu Kyi, not unlike the law that they used in Malaya with the Internal Security Act, not unlike what they've been able to do in quite a lot of places. So they obey the law. He retired from the army, but he retained control. This is a wonderful way of doing things. General Sanu came in, he was a puppet in most respects. Basically, a decent guy. He was never associated with killing people or doing things that one mightn't like. The one who was identified with killing people was him. Brigadier General Sein Lwin, the commander of the Lomtane Riot Security Police. Ne Win, in 1988, recognising what had happened to the country with the price of food and the issue of food, realised that the Burmese way to socialism wasn't working. So he commissioned his deputy, who was another ex-general called A. Ko, to produce a program of economic reform that would meet the needs for the future. A. Ko drew up a plan. They said they would have a party congress in July. In late July 1988, which would adopt the new economic plan, which would allow for economic liberalisation at the base street level. There would be tea shops, there would be cafes, there would be shops doing electrical repair, there'd be service stations, not selling petrol, but doing car maintenance, little stuff, and some liberalisation of foreign investment. So the ACO plan was brought to the Party Congress. The Party Congress collapsed because of the price of food issue and because of rioting in the streets. Ne Win resigned, stormed out of the meeting, resigned, and handed power to Sein Lwin, who was the man who commanded the Riot Security Police. Sein Lwin's performance as commander of the Riot Security Police earned him the title of Butcher of Rangoon. The events that took place on the 8th of August 1988, 88 before 8, so there's various ways of describing this, were what precipitated the downfall of the whole system that Ne Win had created. And so what they did in the party was to nominate, there's Sein Lwin looking benign. Sein Lwin was a ferociously loyal follower of the stars. He had astrologers everywhere. Dr. Maung Maung, former Chief Justice, decent man, good writer, educated in Oxford or Cambridge or somewhere, became the head of state. He's the man who created, or who said he would honour the promise of multi-party elections for the country. And he created an elections commission which would take the country further forward. He lasted not a long time because the army, not at all comfortable with what had happened, and nobody knew what was going on. We were there in a time of great disturbance. It was really difficult to work out which way the country might go. There were people fighting in the streets. Gay saw some horrific atrocities in the street herself. Nobody knew how it would work out. People are reconstructing history now and saying that the army created the events so that they could take power again, maybe, but actually it was out of control. And it was a difficult time for everybody. I remember standing in the embassy in Rangoon with the windows open because people were calling all the time from Australia and the phones worked, wanting to know what's the latest news. So I decided that rather than refer them to Foreign Affairs to get a washed out version of what the truth might be, I would stand beside the open window with the telephone in my hand and shout to get a voice past the noise of the street about what was happening. It was a very theatrical time. Imagine, it was interesting. So how do we go from there to here? Dr. Maung Maung lasted a short time. General Saw Maung, the head of the army, took power. Saw Maung's deputy, there's Saw Maung. Saw Maung lost his mind in a large sense. He wasn't up to the job. Than Shwe, though, to do him a little bit of credit, decided that the country had to move out of the situation it was in. Now, Western countries, including Australia, take credit for this and say it was our sanctions that made the difference. I don't think it was our sanctions that made the difference. I think it was the obvious character of the population. This character of the population is reflected through the army itself. And the evidence of that was available in 1990 when they had those multi-party elections promised by Dr. Maung Maung. There were seats won by the opposition at that time in army bases. The Tenasserim Naval Base, which is the biggest naval base in the country, all the people running in the Tenasserim area for the parliament that were elected were from the opposition. Not a single government candidate got up from there, from the naval base. And the same things happened in Mektula at the Air Force Base. It's commonly believed in Burma, and maybe here too, that the Navy and the Air Force are brighter than the people in the Army. I haven't consulted anybody. And that they can therefore think a little bit more rationally about the country's future. But it was also true of a lot of people in the Army. And people realised that they needed to do something. So Than Shwe is never given any credit for this, but I think it's worth noting that Thein Sein, the president, who is there with Aung San Suu Kyi, is about 14 or 15 years younger than Than Shwe. There is a generation missed by Than Shwe in his appointment of his successor. Than Shwe also appointed the people who are members of Thein Sein's cabinet, because he did that as the departing army head. They are a generation younger than Thein Sein. Another army generation is skipped, and younger people are there. Somehow Than Shwe or somebody with him said, we've got to take the country forward, and it's got to be done with a different generation. It's got to be done with people with a different frame of mind and a different set of priority organisation, a different mindset. So Thein Sein became the president in March 2010. No, March 2011. We came back from Geneva in late 2010 and went through the country on our way back. And we're talking about whereabouts this is going to go. Thein Sein had started to show by that time, by late 2010, a tendency to be a liberal-minded man. Thein Sein was the man who was Prime Minister at the time. Than Shwe was the President, the head of state. Than Shwe was the one who called the shots. Aung San Suu Kyi was in house arrest again, this time, if you remember it, because an American swam across the lake, did some of the most idiotic things you can imagine, and gave the government the excuse to intern her. They obeyed the law when they did that. They worked according to the law. Now, everyone knows that heads of state, kings and queens, can set the law aside if they really want to. Than Shwe didn't want to do that, but he could only give her 1 year. That year expired at the time of the elections in 2010. She didn't take part in the elections, her party boycotted the elections. Opposition parties didn't win many seats, but what people tend to forget, again, is that even those elections, the governing party won about 66% of the vote, which means that 34% voted elsewhere. There was already a clear impression for Than Shwe and other people to understand that they did not have the support of the public that they thought they had. When they rigged the constitutional referendum in 2008 to provide the constitution that's there now, they produced a figure of 94%. 94.7%, I think it was, in favour of the new constitution. The Burmese ambassador in Geneva, who I knew, a man called Wunamang Win, who is now the foreign minister, said, "See, Mr. Lam, see this result. We have 94.7% in favour of the constitution." And I said to him, "Mang Win, it's not as good as North Korea." I had this ability because of the time I'd spent there to talk to people in this kind of way. And he looked a bit sallow, and the bloke who was there taking notes laughed or giggled. Don't you dare do that. So then they came to the time to have these by-elections. Why were the by-elections held? It's because under the Constitution, if you're a member of the Parliament, you cannot remain as a minister if you are named as a minister. So they named, or a deputy minister. There were 45 people in the Parliament who were named as ministers or deputy ministers by Than Shwe's organisation of the future governance of the country. So all these seats became vacant, which meant that they had to have the by-elections. And then we went through this drama of whether the NLD, the National League for Democracy, would take part in the by-elections or not. And people, when I was there in October last year, people were talking about this, should they take part? And one of the people asked me what I thought, and I said, yes, they have to take part. The time has come with Thein Sein's openings. There was a lot of freedom of expression by that time. You could see Burmese language newspapers with stories about decrepitude, about bad education services, poor quality hospitals, things going wrong, corruption, questions being raised. Thein Sein himself had said in his own speech when he was named as president in March 2011, he made a speech about his vision for the country, which is the first speech anybody ever made about their vision for Burma. No leader, including U Nu, ever made a visionary speech. And his vision included one where there would be a parliament elected by the people with members accountable to their people. He directed those who won seats, including the military people, to be accountable to their population. No one had ever heard this word, accountability. And the ministers, he directed them to be accountable to the parliament. He still makes the ministers go to sessions of the parliament, take a question time, not quite as dramatic as ours, and they don't have Peter Slipper in the chair either. A question time, the ministers have to answer questions. They've never had to do that before. This asking and answering of questions is reported in the papers. It's on television. Thein Sein decided, excuse me, that they would open the media. He spoke to the president of the Press Censorship Board about this, who shortly thereafter issued a press conference recommending the abolition of his job and of his board. There's basically no censorship. The opposition television channel, Democratic Voice of Burma, which is run out of Norway, is now available in any tea shop in Burma. You can watch it in your home. None of this was possible when we were there. When Gay and I were there, if you wanted to read English, you read the Working People's Daily, great paper, or The Guardian, which is a hangover from the British Times, and they kept the same masthead, but actually it was a propaganda rag. They're all run by the Ministry of Information. They're not now. There's wide public debate. And the width of this public debate means that the government mightn't have lost control of the situation, but it no longer has the ability to control the news that reaches the public. And that, to me, is probably the basic, most important element in where we go in considering the future. I don't think it's possible for the government to turn back on the reform program that started. Anthony will talk in a moment about where that will take the country in terms of economic progress and what that will mean. But the reform program, which has been initiated by Thein Sein, is there to stay. Aung San Suu Kyi has met Thein Sein a number of times. It's obvious that they get along quite comfortably with each other. That's changed the way the army works. When people say that the army might get rid of all this when Thein Sein goes, maybe they will, but I don't think they'll have the strength to do that in 2015 when the next elections come. And for the time being, until 2015, Thein Sein's the president. The law applies. If the president says this is the way it's to be done, it will be done. The ability to roll Thein Sein under the way the system works in the country isn't there at the moment, and it will continue as it has, in my belief. And that means that the West and the rest of the world has to be engaged with the country as it goes forward. What the West lost because of the wonderful opportunity to impose sanctions and say so from the front steps of Parliament House was the ability to influence events as they went forward. There's been no Western influence on the way Thein Sein has acted. It's not correct that it was because Hillary Clinton went there and stood on a step with Aung San Suu Kyi that the world changed. It didn't happen like that. A lot of things have been written to say that's the case. What hasn't been as much written is the fact that the first foreign minister from anywhere to go to the country and meet both Aung San Suu Kyi and Thein Sein on the same trip was Kevin Rudd. It doesn't suit the American media or the British media or the French media to report that it was Kevin Rudd who did it first, or the Australian media, or even the Australian media, but it's true. And that means too that I believe, because of our place in the country, in Burma, because of our place in the region, because of the very large number of Burmese students who've studied in Australia and formed friendships here, because of the big Burmese community in Australia, not all of whom came as refugees since 1988, many came before that, and many have come and gone since then, that we have a special opportunity in Australia to contribute to this future. And so what I hope we will see in the next couple of months, in the period leading up to around about 2014, when big things will happen in Southeast Asia involving Burma, I'd like to see this country pulled together right across the country and work out how best to take the country forward, and how to do so on the basis of three distinct but important groupings of people from the country, Burma, Myanmar. The first of those groupings is those who live inside the country. We have a lot of stories here, and correctly we have a lot of stories here, about the plight of the people on the border and of the refugees and the people who fled out and are living in camps on the Thai-Burma border or somewhere. And I don't take anything away from the importance of that, but it tends to obscure the poverty and depression that the people suffer and experience in the country who stayed. People who stayed with their children, who are living in a town in central Burma, Burman people, are suffering extreme poverty. Thein Sein recognises that. Thein Sein's visionary speech identified, to the astonishment of a lot of people, the need to lift Burma out of poverty as his top priority. Nobody before had ever admitted that Burma was in poverty. Thein Sein did that. So inside the country, and the people on the border, and the diaspora in countries like Australia, we need to work out how to link the talent that there is within the country. It's a country of high capacity, undeveloped capacity, but high capacity. The people on the border who have equally high capacity and sometimes a great deal that they can contribute with their learning back inside. And then the people in countries like Australia who can bring back to the country the quality of the learning that they've acquired here, either as doctors or scientists or lawyers, or as motor mechanics, as plumbers, as electricians. Everybody's got a part to play, and with that, that country will return to the strength that it had when the British built their biggest banks in Asia, in Rangoon. Thank you very much. I spoke for too long, but
we'd arranged for 20 minutes each, and then some question time. So
what did I have? Only 30. Too long.
Well, I'm here wearing two hats. Firstly, here as a research fellow with the Alfred Deakin Research Institute at Deakin University, but also as a project manager a voluntary project manager for projects in Burma, in Myanmar, with GraceWorks Myanmar. So my details are there. What I want to quickly do is run over a number of points. Firstly, the macro level reform that has already begun to unfold and the things that have happened at that level. Secondly, I'm going to skip very quickly. In fact, I might skip right over why reform will be incremental, because I think all what Chris has actually just shared highlights that, the depth of history, and I was going to go back even further, but the depth of history that is being overcome, and the fears and the sensitivities that many people have carried for a very long time take a long time to change. So there's going to be people involved in politics and in the political leadership of Myanmar who are resistant to change for all manner of sensitivities and so on for many years to come. And we need to be aware of that and sensitive. And I think incremental change has been very rapid in the last year or two, but incremental change rather than revolutionary change is more likely to be the order of the day. I then want to explore some of the micro-level changes, meaning the changes for people who live in villages that have already occurred at this point, but there are still some massive issues remaining. And then I quickly want to finish by talking about some of the implications for humanitarian assistance and for development. Now, our dominant images of Myanmar are formed by some of the history that Chris has just been over. The demonstrations in 1988, the army's crackdown in response to that under Sen Lwin, not under the subsequent rulers, sometimes misinterpreted, missed, but the army crackdown in 88. The standoff between the military generals and Aung San Suu Kyi as being the characterisation of the country. The Saffron Revolution in 2007, one of the first times that Burma it really hit our TV screens, I think, in a significant way, with the pictures of many mass demonstrations or mass parading of monks through the streets of Yangon and other parts of the country. Cyclone Nargis in 2008, which I believe was a very instrumental turning point, doubling the number of Westerners in the country and Western agencies in the country providing humanitarian assistance, who had to work hand in hand with government agencies, with government departments in delivering that aid and rebuilding some of the trust which had been eroded for a very long period of history. So I think that's very, very instrumental. Last October, before Hillary Clinton's visit, Kurt Campbell, the US Secretary of State for Asia and Pacific, visited Myanmar, and on his way out at the airport he made this statement. He said, I think it would be fair to say that the winds of change are clearly blowing through Burma. The extent of it is still unclear, but everyone who's gone there recognises there are changes. And I think what we've seen since then are even more significant changes. Let me just pop a few up here. We know that back in 2003, the Burmese implemented a roadmap to democracy. It was in response to Thailand, who was the chair of ASEAN at the time, suggesting that in joining ASEAN, Burma needed to adopt some democratic change, or at least have a roadmap towards that. And so the Thais were prepared to put a proposal on the table. The Burmese wanted to have their own proposal, and so they put that forth in August 2003. Set a wheel in motion very slowly, but it did lead to the constitutional referendum in May 2008. You'll remember that was very controversial. It was held just a week after Cyclone Nargis, and it was almost in denial of the humanitarian emergency in the country. Nonetheless, the constitution was promulgated in 2008 with all its flaws and with all its faults. Led to elections on the 7th of November, and as Chris said, they carefully snuck those elections in while Aung San Suu Kyi was still under house arrest, because her legal term under arrest came to an end on the 13th of November, and they were not prepared to unilaterally decide to extend her house arrest without due process or without some sort of cause and legal basis for that. So she was released on the 13th of November. The 30th of March, the State Peace and Development Council, the ruling junta, was dissolved, Thein Sein was inaugurated, and Parliament was opened. And I've put a summary there of his inauguration speech, the speech he made that Chris has alluded to. And the things that he was talking about actually are astounding compared to the 50 years of military leadership of the Burmese state prior to that. National reconciliation, an end to corruption, market-oriented economy, foreign investment, develop health and education, deal with poverty, and cooperate with international and local organisations. Yes, he still said we still need a strong modern military to defend against neo-colonialism. However, it was a bit near impossible for him to have not said some of those sorts of words. Those changes are continued, and I think that's, to me, is the most in looking at the track record since then. That was the end of March. By April, and there's still many things that we would like to see happen that haven't yet happened, but by April, just days later, he began appointing special advisors to the president who were not from a military background, including academics, including, for example, U Mint, who's a friend of Chris's, who I've had some correspondence with myself, an academic by background who's written papers very critical of previous Burmese economic policies and policies towards the poor, appointed as the chief economic advisor to the state. U Mint went ahead in May, just 2 months after the new parliament was formed, to run a rural poverty alleviation workshop for the heads of departments and for the cabinet ministers in Naypyidaw. By August, he was running a workshop on reforms for national economic development, where ideas from a non-military background, from the civil society sector, were being aired and were being listened to, and several made it into policy. Now, that hasn't happened in over 50 years. Car imports in September, for all the faults of the scheme they brought in, the changes to car import regulations have sent a lot of new cars in the country and have broken some of the power of the cronies that was controlling that sector of the economy up to that point. The Mitsoni Dam being suspended in September was a huge decision, not only because of civil society advocacy, but the Chinese had put $3.6 billion of investment in, and they said to China, no. Now, all sorts of internal political reasons for that. However, it's a massive step for them to take to stand up against China in that way. Also in September, the formation of a National Human Rights Commission to look into human rights allegations. One of the first things that Human Rights Commission suggested was the release of prisoners, particularly political prisoners. It was followed up in October with the release of almost 6,500 prisoners. Most of the political prisoners remained in prison, but there have been subsequent releases of many of them. Censorship was very largely removed, as Chris has said. Money changes and a money exchange, a floating currency effectively with legal money changes. Suu Kyi at that point came out and said we've reached a point where there is an opportunity for change. And up to that point, the opposition of the NLD to engage directly in the political process. At this point, she said, now I believe that the change is looking genuine and we should work within the system rather than from outside. And so at this point, this was 6 months ago, the NLD announced that they would re-enter politics. ASEAN responded by offering them the 2014 chairmanship of ASEAN. December, Hillary Clinton visited. A year ago, certainly 18 months ago, any one of these, anything on that screen would have looked ridiculous to even suggest. 18 months certainly ago would have looked ridiculous to even propose. So this month, we saw on the 1st of April, we saw the by-elections where the Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy emerged now as the largest opposition party in Parliament, taking up their seats today. All 4 seats in Naypyidaw, the new capital city, largely primarily populated by civil servants, all 4 seats were won by the NLD over army and military, the regime-appointed party officials. David Cameron's visit, and I put a quote up there, Suu Kyi suggesting that she believes that President Thein Sein is genuine about democratic reform and that the suspension of sanctions now, this is April, this was 2 weeks ago, would strengthen the hand of the reformers. And I think that's the key point from this, is despite all the faults and despite all the issues that are at hand, we do have hardliners and we do have reformers, and we need to find a way as the West, who are very quick and ready to put sanctions in place now to back the reformers somehow and strengthen their hand to continue with the change that's in place. I was there immediately after the by-elections. I cut back about a week and a half ago and visited, and I was actually out in one of the electorates in Liverpool where one of the 88 student demonstration leaders has now been elected to Parliament, and people were quite ecstatic actually in the area, I must say. What I couldn't believe though was walking through the streets of Yangon and picking up the latest copy of the Myanmar Times, and here's the cover of the special by-elections issue, and seeing photographs of the election victory, 4-page spread, 4 double-page spread, that would have probably put someone in jail and certainly would never have got past the censors even a year ago. And to me that was just so symbolic of the level of change that could actually be being sold on the streets quite freely. I'm not going to read these quotes. I'm sure we'll make these slides available online. Certainly, I'm happy to do that, and people can read it. But the International Crisis Group in Brussels, Gareth Evans was the head of the International Crisis Group until fairly recently, monitoring crisis situations around the world and just speaking very positively about the degree of change that has happened. I'm going to skip over quite a few slides because Chris has covered a good deal of the material anyway. But I want to just jump through to this bit, that the regime over the last 20 years has been very hesitant to implement some of the reforms that were being spoken of in the 88 to 90 era, or 87 to 90 era, for a number of reasons, and those reasons include things like a very profound fear of the breakup of the union, the breakup along ethnic lines and or particularly along ethnic lines based on the civil war that actually really dates back to British colonial era, and again some of that's in the slides that I just skipped over. And the perpetuation of national sovereignty, protection against neo-colonialism, protection against the West effectively seizing control of leaders of the state and directing it in a different direction. And that fear we've seen in many countries around the world, but has been extremely strong in the regime over the last 50 years, really, over the various regimes, and certainly has been a big part of the philosophy underpinning and the resistance to change. What we've seen, I'd say, in the last year and a half, has been a crumbling of some of those fears. Again, I believe because of a degree of trust building and a degree of genuineness by people like Thein Sein to actually engage in real reconciliation within the country. So I think change will be incremental because we're seeing some traditional ideology competing with modern ideas, and there are some significant sensitivities to be overcome, and that there is still a great deal of trust building to be undertaken before reforms will be fully grounded. And in particular, I'll get back to this in a moment, the race issues in Myanmar need to be dealt with very significantly. Probably the biggest outstanding issue. Okay, at the micro level, because I've been speaking at the macro level, at the micro level, let me give you Three stories that just sum up the degree of change that is now happened. This network advocacy group, initially called a Nagas Action Group, a civil society group that emerged immediately after Cyclone Nagas to work with communities, and you see their approach listed up there. And I was talking with Bobby Milne, who formed the network advocacy group in 2008. I was talking with him just 2 weeks ago, and he was telling me this story of gains they have made this year because of the political change. Fishermen in many parts of the Delta region of Myanmar have, over the last 20 years, lost the rights to fishing in the local rivers because the federal government, now in Naypyidaw, were giving out fishing licences on a commercial basis, and often that was based on connections. And so the local villagers lost the right to fish in their own rivers, and it was being enforced. And so that was threatening their food security and their livelihood. What they've done is they've gone throughout this region, and particularly around the Pepon area, and have helped form a number of fisherfolk or fishermen associations. Those associations have been able to go and not just talk at the township level with government officials, but also at the regional level, and in 6 townships now through that region of the Delta, they have now been granted free of charge commons fishing licences in the river that they used to have 20, 30, 40 years ago, and that were the main food source and livelihood source for many of the people. That kind of advocacy would have landed people in jail, and an organisation trying to organise that sort of advocacy would have been closed down very quickly just a couple of years ago. And to me, this highlights the growing confidence of civil society, the growing diversity of actors within the political process. Yes, there are an enormous amount of problems with corruption and cronyism, and that we could go on with the list. There are enormous obstacles to overcome, but this is a sign of enormous hope that people can go and talk with, even at the region. Normal, uneducated fishermen can go and collectively, through collective action, implement that level of change for their own future. A similar story that ActionAid were telling me just 2 weeks ago that happened late last year, in the end of the wet season last year, a dam up in central Myanmar that the dam wall was washed away, and the village, they had a fellow, as they call them, a worker in the community, a local in the community, a university student, a recent graduate, just trying to facilitate some basic democratic principles and help the community organise for their own future. And they wanted to reconstruct this dam because it was so important in the dry zone for the irrigation for the crops. And so the first thing they did, once they identified the project that they needed, was to go and approach the local government. And again, that's just an outstanding example that they would even go and approach the local government to rebuild the dam. The the officials were very honest and said, we know you need a dam and we've got no money to do it with. So they went back and had some more planning meetings, and they decided to collect that they could collect enough rocks. They actually decided they wanted to double the size of the dam. They could collect enough rocks themselves, and they sent out 5 villages worth of people collecting rock by hand, and piled the rock up for the new dam wall. They found an NGO that was prepared to donate cement for the dam wall, and they went out and they made the contacts themselves to get the NGO involved. I'm not sure which NGO it wasn't ActionAid. ActionAid, and then they went back to the government and said, okay, we've got the rock and we've got the cement all lined up. The government said, well, we've got a bulldozer sitting here, we've got no petrol for it, but you're welcome to use it. And so then they went back to ActionAid and asked for the petrol, the diesel, to run the bulldozer. And through their collective effort, these 5 villages in the end got together and built a dam of twice the capacity, and it has just been completed. And this sort of civil society action has not been possible in Myanmar to any great degree, certainly prior to Cyclone Nagas. And I see exactly what Chris was saying, that the reform has become too grounded now, and the civil society is growing in its strength and confidence. And the government is becoming more responsive to the people, despite the... Now, I know there's all manner of problems, and I'm just going to finish by just listing out some of the issues that remaining. This is my last slide, but just talking about the need for constitutional reform. The need for some means and mechanisms to be put in place that should Suu Kyi win and the NLD win in 2015, the next elections. Some means to actually think about how they're going to hand over power and what that's going to mean. peace between with the ethnic minorities, and some of that has happened in recent time. For example, the discussion just this last month or two with the Karen has been fantastic, but there's still way too much human rights abuse and fighting up in Kachin State in particular at the moment, and some really clear end or resolution to the ethnic demands and the ethnic concerns, the concerns of losing their identity as in the process of state building. The state needs to have a way forward to build a modern nation state in a way that embraces the aspirations of ethnic minorities. And that's common around the world, but Myanmar has not found a way through that mess for a very long time. Lack of institution and technical capability, and that's, I think, one of the big changes for aid and development looking forward, is that it's going to come a point very soon, and I think personally that we're at that point, that we need to begin to help engage with the various government departments and agencies in building the technical capability of actually being able to follow through and implement the sort of reforms that they are now saying, or that they've been saying for over a year now they plan on doing and wanting to do. And then there is the reforming of the economy that really is an absolute mess. And the lack, for example, of rural finance, or the ability for farmers or for business people to be able to borrow in the normal course of operating a business, that is just preventing, even at the very most grassroots level, preventing economic growth from beginning to take off. So there are some massive issues. I could have added cronyism and corruption and vested interests and all manner of other things on that slide. It's certainly nowhere near complete. There's massive obstacles, but I do believe reform is genuine, and I do believe that it is that we've got an opportunity in front of us now that hasn't been in place for at least 50 years in Myanmar, probably a lot longer. Thank you.
Anthony and Chris, thank you very much for a tour de force, and collective apologies for running slightly out of time, but I think the quality of what we've just heard more than justify that. We do have time for a few questions, and in your questions I'll ask them to be brief, because they'll probably invite brief answers, so we can squeeze as many questions in as possible, and I'll ask you to state your name and affiliation. So,
Ron Brown, Australian Green Foundation. I'm just wondering if either or both the speakers could comment on what perhaps a bit of an inside type of cabinet issue as to what's going on in the higher levels of government and army that does result in the perpetuation of aggressive fighting in Kachin State and continuing fighting in Karen State, despite the good things that may be happening this time. Do you want to jump in?
Thank you. I don't think I know the answer to that question. One of the difficulties that there is in working out what the future of the combination that was created by the British in 1947 is going to be is that no one knew the answer then, and no one yet knows the answer. One of the things that people have been hoping is that the arrival of the NLD in power might somehow wave a magic wand over all these things and make the problems go away, but in my view it won't. And I think that one of the things that if you go and see the film of The Lady, one of the things it will lead you to believe is that she has massive support in the ethnic regions. I don't think the evidence is there to sustain that belief. It's beautiful for Luc Besson in the film, but I don't think it's there in real life. The quandary of what to do about the future of the country is in more or less the same state as it was when Ne Win took power in March 1962. Nobody knows the answer. The efforts of Thein Sein to try to broker peace deals with the others have been, I think, honest and decent and properly run. But if you think of the Karen, and I'd be interested to talk to you more about this and meet another time. If you think of the border Karen and the people from the state, and then you think about the Karen from the Delta, and you then consider ask yourself the question is there such a thing as a united Karen people with a particular view, and the answer is no. If you take that across a lot of the other groups, you will get the same answer. In the elections, in the by-elections just held, it was interesting to me that there were, of the 45 seats that were contested, 43 are won by the NLD. One of the seats, the NLD's candidate was disqualified, was unable to run as a candidate, and probably fairly. He doesn't appear to have been a citizen of the country. And in the other one, which they didn't win, it seemed likely that seat would go to a Shan party, but it didn't. It went in the end to the USDP, the government party. It was the only seat they won. So the number of votes that went to the ethnic political parties was not very high for the Pithu Hluttaw, the lower house of parliament. For the Amyota Hluttaw, the upper house of parliament, the figures were a little different. The Shans won 16.5% of the vote at the upper house, and they got one seat out of that for the upper house of the parliament. But the numbers aren't there to really take the argument further forward. And I don't know why the fighting has continued, and they blame each other, as you know. And I suspect they're both right in blaming each other.
I would simply add to that it's very clear that there are some hardliners even in the cabinet, and certainly within the parliament there are a lot of hardliners as well. At the moment, and I would say quite well entrenched now, we have the reformers very much in power, but there are some very strong voices and personalities that are not really happy with where the change is at or is heading. And I'm not sure that the strong chain of command throughout the military or through the fact that many of the army, the 25% of seats that the constitution gives the army to appoint into parliament rather than being elected, many of those have actually been genuinely representing their local community and against some of their own party politics positions. Suggests that a real sense of discipline and chain of command doesn't really exist either in the politics or the military.
There's a little point on that which Anthony and I discussed yesterday, which we haven't yet seen what that really means, and it might even relate to this issue of what to do with the army. The army officers appointed to the 25% of the seats by Than Shwe in the time when that parliament came together were very often young, inexperienced, relatively junior officers. A lot of them have just been replaced by more senior people. We don't know what that means. It might mean that the government or Thein Sein has decided there need to be people with a greater capacity to act with a responsibility that the others in the army will follow. And if Thein Sein says this is the way we're going to handle the ethnic regions, then army members of parliament will hear it there and take it from the parliament to the command structure. Or it might mean that the hardliners have taken control and said, we want to get rid of all these young people, they've got too many ideas, we want solid old golfers in there instead. But we don't yet quite know the answer to some of these things.
Yes, sir.
Jeffrey Babb. First of all, I understand that Burma is dominated by the Burman people who are basically situated in the Irrawaddy Basin, and the nationalities virtually surround that, the Karen, the Kachin, the Shan. That's the first thing. Secondly, is Thein Sein a Burmese Gorbachev, which has been described as in the press? And secondly, what part does Theravada Buddhism play in Burmese national life?
Theravada Buddhism plays a very, very large role in national life, and that's part of the ethnic issue, in fact, because several of the ethnic groups don't follow Theravada Buddhism, and so there is a religious difference as well. And so the feeling that they are being tried, that there's an attempt to convert them to Buddhism as well as convert them to Myanmar culture or Burman culture, as opposed to it is a big part of the feeling. Theravada Buddhism does play a large part, but it's interesting to see Aung San Suu Kyi's use over 20 years of Buddhist concepts and reinterpreting those concepts and the power and interpreting in many ways, maybe like the Dalai Lama, definitely like what's his name, the Vietnamese monk in California, Pan. Yes, yeah. Reinterpreting Buddhist ideas from a far more in a democratic and human rights perspective, and I think it's very much there within Buddhism. So it plays a big part, but it's part of the debate. It's being contested.
You'll be glad to know that an American congressman, who obviously follows the country with tremendous care, has proposed to the Nobel Peace Committee that Aung San Suu Kyi and Thein Sein should receive the Nobel Peace Prize together on the model of de Klerk and Mandela.
Or Henry Kissinger and TF.
That's right, various Israelis and Egyptians and other people. A joint prize for people who have made a massive and lasting contribution is something which, if I were Aung San Suu Kyi and Thein Sein, I'd say, I'd rather have it posthumously. I don't want it to poison the rest of my life. But and I don't think that Thein Sein would be seen as a Gorbachev. But on the other hand, he came from within the system and changed the system. Thein Sein was within the SPDC process, then he became Prime Minister. He showed no evidence of wanting to do anything very dramatic until he became the President. And then he showed that immediately with that speech that Anthony had on the wall. As for religion, I'd just make a little comment about all these things. We helped form, we didn't initiate it, but we helped form a thing called the Interfaith Relief Committee. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians and Hindus. And they met at our house, the Australian Ambassador's house, and once or twice in the embassy itself because of the security problems there were at the time. And they reached their decision, the Buddhists, Christians, Muslims and Hindus, and they were priests and monks and imams and Hindus. They worked out whereabouts was the greatest need. And they organised the method of distribution, and they organised also the shopping list. So medicines, nutritional support for children, things for pregnant women, whatever it might be, and we then moved the stuff out. Gay deserves the Nobel Prize better than Suchi. That showed an evidence of the people's willingness to work together, and I think it would be fair to say that with the exception of a couple of people who you might describe as fundamentalists out of the United States, taking harsh religious positions from some of the camps anyway, that religion hasn't played a part in division in the country, and that's quite interesting because in some of the countries surrounding it, religion has played a serious part, but they've kept it away in Myanmar.
We have time for one more question and two more answers. Ma'am, you've had your hand up for long.
Kirsty Taylor, Melbourne University Master of International Relations student. Anthony, you mentioned that you think the change will be incremental, but what we've seen in the last 12 months, it's been incredibly fast, especially in lieu of where the junta reacted to the 2007 and 2008 events. Do you think there's a possibility that expectations will outstrip the pace of change and it might all end up very civilly, chaotically and nastily?
That's a big fear. That is a very big fear. I think it needs to be incremental to take everybody along, and I'm actually very impressed with the extent to which Aung San Suu Kyi has made those statements about wanting to work cooperatively and bring the army and the USDP politicians along on the agenda as well. And I hope that they can do that. 2015 is not far away really in terms of grounding reform, and there are a lot of people who I don't think are really on board at the moment. And so there's a long way to get everybody on board, yeah. I think that answer your question well enough.
Kind of.
I think that there needs to be incremental if we're going to see it grounded and it lasting. That if there is, and that many in the West have been calling, before we lifted sanctions, for example, there's been a lot of calls, particularly in this last week or two, discussions in America about their sanctions, that we can't, they're suggesting we can't lift sanctions until all this long list of, and I guess I'm reacting to the American debate to some extent in making this suggestion, that I think that shopping list of what we would like to see happen is a little premature, and if that did happen, we'd probably see a greater reaction from the hardliners than we've seen at this point, and I wouldn't want to see that sort of reaction.
How do you think the government manages that pace of change so it's fast enough but not too
I
fast?
don't know how they're managing it. I'm staggered that Thein Sein is holding it together and is able to get this much reform done in this little amount of time, and I just hope and pray that it continues and he continues to hold it together.
One of the things that I think is important, and this goes back to what I said at the end of my little statement, is the way a country like Australia reacts to the change that there's been. These people will be watching very carefully the way we act and the way we assess and what we do with it. Sydney Meyer and the people from AsiaLink here in Melbourne, and people from big companies that have investment interest in the country, people from different walks of life, held an instalment of the program that the AsiaLink have called the Conversations. They did this in Yangon, the Conversations. They met with people from government, people from private companies, people from the academic sector, people from foundations and NGOs, and they had a conversation about where the country was likely to go and what the pace needed to be. they'll have to do that again. People are not used to this kind of thing. It's all new to them. How can we possibly reach a decision when we're talking to people who were in jail until last week, or who've never been allowed to read anything different? Do we want to rush them into a decision about something they don't understand? How do we turn incremental into action? And this, to me, will be in part answered by how Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD handle the 43 seats that they've got in Parliament. Are they going to stay on an agenda looking at human rights and constitutional reform, or are they going to get to an agenda that understands what the public voted for? Schools, doctors, roads, things that work, electricity more than 4 hours a day or something like that, or 4 hours a week. There's the decision that Suu Kyi has to take about where she wants her party to go. And in a way she gave the answer to that when they decided they would swear the oath and take their seats in the Parliament. She said, and we talked about this too beforehand, they voted our people into the Parliament, they want us to act as members of Parliament. The involvement of all parts of the constellation in taking this universe forward will determine the speed and the ability of it all to work. What will then matter is the way that the countries that can actually help to make a difference inside act on that. Are we in Australia, is the United States able to do anything? Will the United States regard its job as being done if some congressman nominates Suu Kyi and feigns same for the Nobel Peace Prize, or will they actually do something of significance? Will Kurt Campbell talk about a bit more than winds of change? Winds of change blow up dust. What's there when it settles, and what are we going to do about that? How do we as Australians translate what Kevin Rudd did and Carr has sworn to continue, which was doubling the Australian aid program for the country? What do we want to do with a doubled program? So where do we think it needs to go? How do we assess it can go? How do we get intelligent, well-developed views from within the country about what they want? How do we avoid doing the traditional thing for donors, and exhibited day after day by countries like the United States, I regret to say, of parachuting the aid in because we worked it out in Washington? We need to know what they need. We need to talk to the Karen. We need to talk to the Kachin. We need to talk to the Burmans. We need to have a community-based network, such as what you've mentioned, that will give the world the advice about what their priorities are, and we need their parliament to be the thing that helps to translate that into action which the government itself will support. And we need to keep the brakes on some of the things that people might want. In the very beginning, Suu Kyi behaved very much like the Oxford University Amnesty International graduate that she really was at one time. She's learned an awful lot. You don't actually learn a lot about what she learned from watching The Lady. But I still commend it to you, the film, and my closing remark would be that the film is full of inaccuracies and distortions, full of cardboard cutouts of generals, full of beautiful pictures of nice places, and despite all that, a good film. If you go along to it with making a few notes about what you want to challenge later on, you will find the facts in Wikipedia that Luc Besson didn't bother to check before he made the film, but it's still a good film.